un jour, comme un éventail de l'amour, dans la lumière du soleil. Raconte-moi.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would kindly take your seats, we will now begin with our forum. Meine Damen und Herren, nehmen Sie bitte Ihre Plätze ein, damit wir jetzt mit dem Forum beginnen können. Vielen Dank. Many thanks. Guten Tag, bonjour. Hello, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the 15th International Economic Forum on Africa. I'm Melinda Crane, Chief Political Correspondent at the Deutsche Welle, and it is my very great honor to accompany you today as moderator. As many of you know, this forum has become a veritable institution. This year, as in the past, it brings together OECD and African leaders from government, business, academia, and civil society. It's a great honor to have so many key decision makers with us here today. This 15th forum is at the same time unique. It's meeting for the first time in Germany under the auspices of this country's G7 presidency as a sign of just how much importance Germany attaches to strong relations with Africa. And, as you know, we convene at a truly propitious moment, just 2 weeks before the signing of the new Sustainable Development Goals, just 3 months before the finalizing of a new climate change agreement. Together, these initiatives will transform our approach to development on a global scale. At the same time, Africa's solid growth prospects and own Pan-African initiatives such as Agenda 2063 offer the continent an unprecedented opportunity to foster sustainable and inclusive growth. So it is a very good time to assess the outlook for Africa and for cooperation between Africa and the OECD countries. And that is what we will do in the first opening session of today's forum. It's devoted to the topic Beyond 2015, Africa's Development Agenda. We'll hear 2 welcome addresses from our co-hosts, followed by 2 keynotes, and then we'll build on the impulses that they provide with a very high-ranking panel discussion. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We do have headsets for simultaneous translation. On channel 1, you will find English. On channel 2, you will find German. And on channel 3, you will find French. Please keep those headsets throughout the course of the day because we do also have multilingual sessions in the afternoon. And please do then return the devices before you leave. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our sign is #AfricaForum, and our conference is also being streamed live online, so let me take this opportunity also to greet our online audience. A very warm welcome to all of you as well. And now we begin with remarks from a minister who for much of this year has been warning that mass migration makes a new approach to Africa imperative. He has inaugurated a new Africa policy within his own ministry, and he's called on the EU to follow suit. It is my great pleasure to hand over now to our host, Germany's Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Minister Gerd Müller. Excellency, the stage is yours. Very nice to see you.
Verehrte Gäste, wir blicken heute auf Afrika. Und auch im Namen der deutschen Bundeskanzlerin darf ich Sie alle sehr herzlich begrüßen. Ich freue mich über so viele herausragende Gäste, die wir heute hier in Berlin bei unserem Forum haben. Und darf an der Spitze Herrn Präsident Mahama herzlich willkommen heißen, ebenso mit unserem Bundespräsidenten Herrn Köhler. Ich freue mich, Sie hier begrüßen zu können und auch als Redner anschließend ans Podium zu bitten. Darüber hinaus natürlich mit ganz besonderer Freude dir, Mr. Kofi Annan, herzlich willkommen hier in Berlin als ganz besonderer Ehrengast dieses Forums. Ich begrüße für die Afrikanische Union Herrn Mechenga, herzlich willkommen, und für die OECD Herrn Kapferer. Wir bedanken uns sehr bei Ihnen für die hervorragende Kooperation und diese Möglichkeit, erstmals, ich glaube, nach 48 Jahren hier in Deutschland, in Berlin, nicht in Paris, diese Tagung, dieses Forum ausrichten zu dürfen. Afrika, unser Chancen- und Partnerkontinent. Lassen Sie mich einige einleitende Ausführungen machen. Afrika, unser Chancen- und Partnerkontinent. Ich sage dies ganz bewusst. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, so viele prominente Gäste aus dem afrikanischen Kontinent, aber auch aus ganz Europa und aus Deutschland begrüßen zu können. Ganz besonders freue ich mich über die Freunde und Partner, die wir heute sehen. Mit diesem Forum wollen wir unsere Freundschaft vertiefen. Wir wollen neue Wege der Zusammenarbeit erörtern und das ist mir persönlich sehr wichtig, wir wollen das Bild vom Krisenkontinent Afrika in Deutschland und in Europa korrigieren. Dazu hat auch gestern das große Unternehmerforum, der Africa Summit, Business Summit, glaube ich, erheblich beigetragen. Afrika, und das sage ich auch an die Medien, die ich herzlich willkommen heiße, ist ein Kontinent, den wir in Deutschland, in Europa viel differenzierter betrachten müssen. 100-mal so groß wie Deutschland, 54 Staaten, viele tausend Sprachen, Kulturen, Ethnien, Religionen. Für Afrika steht Vielfalt und Dynamik. Und deshalb muss unser Blick viel differenzierter, aber auch viel optimistischer sein, wie dies landläufig der Fall ist. Und dazu darf ich einige Fakten auch nennen. Nur 5% der Afrikaner leben in Krisen- und Kriegsgebieten. Wenn man die öffentlichen Darstellungen, die Medienberichte in Deutschland, in Europa sieht, dann meint man, es sei umgekehrt 95%. Nein, die Mittelschichten wachsen. Jedes zweite afrikanische Land gehört inzwischen zu den sogenannten Middle-Income-Countries. Afrika ist ein Kontinent mit einem unglaublichen Reichtum an Ressourcen. Ich nenne als erstes natürlich die Menschen, die Jugend, die jungen Menschen, Millionen von jungen Menschen, die nach vorne drängen, eine Zukunft für sich erhoffen und erarbeiten möchten. Natürlich der Reichtum an Ressourcen, wir haben gestern darüber gesprochen, die Bodenschätze, das fruchtbare Land, einzigartige Flora und Fauna. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, und ich möchte auch ganz bewusst einige Beispiele herausgreifen, wo viele Länder Afrikas heute auf äußerst erfolgreiche Entwicklung zurückblicken. Präsident Mahama wird auf Ghana eingehen, wo ich vor einigen Monaten mich vor Ort überzeugen konnte vom Aufbruch dieses Landes, von der Stabilität, von wirtschaftlichen Impulsen. Aber auch ein Land beispielsweise wie Äthiopien. Vor wenigen Jahren, gerade in Deutschland, ist Äthiopien ein Bild, das fast jeder Deutsche sozusagen abgespeichert hat, aber ein Bild von gestern, nicht von heute. Äthiopien, vor wenigen Jahren noch geprägt von Hunger und Dürre, befindet sich auf dem Weg zum landwirtschaftlichen Selbstversorger. Und dies werden wir ganz gezielt unterstützen, so wie in einer Reihe anderer afrikanischer Staaten. Der Kontinent kann und muss zum Selbstversorger werden. Ich nenne im bevölkerungsreichsten Land Afrikas, in Nigeria, fand gerade ein friedlicher Machtwechsel statt. Präsident Buhari, den ich in München beim G7-Gipfel sprechen konnte, setzt mutige Zeichen des Aufbruchs. Oder ein Land wie Tunesien beispielsweise befindet sich auf einem erfolgreichen Kurs, nicht nur wirtschaftlich, auch in der Ausbildung von demokratischen, rechtsstaatlichen Institutionen und ist heute auch in einer Situation, dass Tunesien den allergrößten Teil des europäischen Rechtsrahmens erfüllen würde. In vielen Ländern Afrikas, auch das für viele in Deutschland in der Wirtschaft, das war gestern auch die Resonanz, 500.000 deutsche Unternehmen allein sind in ausländischen Staaten, in Partnerstaaten engagiert, aber nur 1.000 in Afrika. Und diesen Unternehmern sei ein Beispiel der digitalen Revolution gesandt. Nirgends auf der Welt ist der Mobilfunk und der Internetsektor so stark gewachsen wie auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent. Afrika gehört zu den am stärksten wachsenden Märkten für Mobiltelefone, für Tablets und Laptops. Das einige Beispiele für den Chancen, den Aufbruch, den Zukunftskontinent, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Und deshalb hat unsere Bundeskanzlerin Frau Merkel diese Partnerschaft mit Afrika sicher auch stark inspiriert von Ihnen, Herr Professor Köhler, der Sie hier Wegweisendes in den letzten 20 Jahren auf den Weg gebracht haben. Sicher hat die Kanzlerin dies aufgegriffen, auch beim G7-Gipfel und die Bedeutung der Zusammenarbeit Europas, aber auch der Industriestaaten der G7 mit Afrika besonders herausgehoben. Wir haben dazu Initiativen vereinbart, die ich nur stichpunktartig nenne, denn wir wollen konkreter werden in der Zusammenarbeit. Ernährungssicherung. Wir wollen eine Welt ohne Hunger schaffen und wir können dies in gemeinsamer Partnerschaft. Das Thema Klimaschutz, das 2-Grad-Ziel werden wir nur in Kooperation mit den afrikanischen Staaten erreichen können. Und hier stehen die Industriestaaten in ganz besonderer Verantwortung. Wenn wir den CO2-Ausstoß pro Kopf und Tonne in Deutschland mit Ghana vergleichen, dann ist es in etwa der 10-fache Pro-Kopf-Anteil. Die afrikanischen Staaten werden am meisten unter den Auswirkungen des Klimawandels, der Erwärmung leiden. Stichwort Katastrophen, aber auch das Stichwort Klimaflüchtlinge, das wir hier berücksichtigen müssen. Und deshalb reichen wir Ihnen die Hand, auch mit Blick auf Paris, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, verehrte Gäste, einen gemeinsamen Weg zu finden, in Verantwortung jeder seinen Beitrag zu erbringen, die Minderungsziele zu erreichen, aber, und da bin ich beim dritten Punkt, auch Investitionen in die Zukunft beispielsweise der Energieversorgung ihrer Länder voranzubringen. Deutschland allein verbraucht so viel Strom wie alle 54 afrikanischen Staaten. Die Sicherung der Ernährung und die Sicherung nachhaltiger Energieversorgung, der Aufbau eines Energieversorgungssystems sind Überlebensfragen für Millionen von Menschen. Und hier müssen wir auch und gerade in unserem Interesse partnerschaftlich zusammenarbeiten. Wir wollen, das konnte ich beim Afrika-Outreach in München auf den Weg bringen und dies wird eines der Schwerpunktthemen beim EU-Afrika-Gipfel in La Valletta sein. Wir können und wir müssen gemeinsam eine Ausbildungsinitiative starten, insbesondere für afrikanische Frauen und Mädchen, aber für die Jugend insgesamt. Bildung, Ausbildung, Ausbildung ist Investition in die Zukunft ihrer Länder, in unserer aller Zukunft. Denn nur gemeinsam mit Afrika und seiner Jugend, mit bald 2 Milliarden Afrikanerinnen und Afrikanern, können wir die globalen Fragen lösen. Ich nannte das Thema Klimaschutz, Energieversorgung, Migration und Sicherheitsfragen, aber auch das Thema Welthandel. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, beim Thema Welthandel lassen Sie mich eine Anmerkung machen. Unser Wohlstand der G7-Staaten, der Reichtum, auch hier in Deutschland, der Reichtum in den Industriestaaten, der baut in ganz erheblichem Maße und Umfang auf den Ressourcen ihrer Länder, ihrer Staaten auf. 20% der Menschheit, die Industriestaaten, die G7, 20% der Menschheit verbrauchen 80% der natürlichen Ressourcen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Und wenn wir in Partnerschaft nach vorne gehen wollen, dann steht auf der einen Seite die Verstärkung der Entwicklungszusammenarbeit über öffentliche Mittel und Projekte. Aber wir brauchen in ganz erheblichem und dringendem Maße eine wesentliche Verstärkung der Privatinvestitionen, der Kooperationen unserer Unternehmen, der Kooperationen unserer Kammern und unserer Betriebe. Und darüber hinaus, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wir brauchen faire Handelsbedingungen. Wir brauchen den Marktzugang für afrikanische Produkte. Wir brauchen eine Stärkung auch der verarbeitenden Industrie, Investitionen in ihren Ländern. Und es ist mir ein großes Anliegen, dass wir bei den verhandelten Welthandelsabkommen, Stichwort TTIP, USA, der große europäisch-amerikanische Markt, nicht vom Freihandels-, sondern vom Fairhandelsabkommen sprechen und dabei auch die Interessen Afrikas, Herr Präsident Mahama, wir haben darüber gesprochen, nicht nur nicht aus dem Auge verlieren, sondern explizit mit einbringen und einführen, ihnen die Chancen zum Marktzugang mit zu eröffnen und in Zukunft die Wertschöpfungsketten, die wir uns mit ihren Ländern, unsere Industrie, unsere Konzerne verbinden, fair und gerecht gestalten, sozial und ökologisch. Auf dieser Basis kann und wird und muss eine Entwicklung in Richtung moderne, prosperierende Staaten erfolgen. Wir müssen aber auch, wenn ich dies kurz sagen darf, ich komme eben aus der Beratung des Deutschen Bundestages, wo in Europa im Augenblick die Flüchtlingsthematik 800.000 Flüchtlinge, die in diesem Jahr prognostiziert sind, allein nach Deutschland, im Augenblick 15 bis 20% davon aus afrikanischen Staaten. Wir müssen darüber gemeinsam miteinander sprechen. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, es liegt in der gemeinsamen Verantwortung auf der einen Seite der afrikanischen Länder, auf die Frage eine Antwort zu finden, warum flüchten diese Menschen? Wie können wir Kriminalität und Schlepperwesen gemeinsam bekämpfen? Und wie können wir gemeinsam Perspektiven für Millionen, für Hunderte von Millionen von Menschen schaffen, damit sie in ihren Ländern auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent eine Perspektive für sich und ihre Familien finden? Auch dies ist ein Thema, das wir heute im Rahmen des Tages, aber beim Gipfel in La Valletta besprechen werden müssen. Die Europäische Union wird und muss und kann die hauptbetroffenen afrikanischen Länder unterstützen. Aber es ist natürlich auch in ihrer Verantwortung, hier Antworten zu finden. Den Menschen fehlt eine Aussicht auf ein besseres Leben, auf Sicherheit, auf Arbeit und Zukunft. Und natürlich liegt der Schlüssel in der ökonomischen Entwicklung Afrikas. Ich habe auf Positivbeispiele angesprochen. 6 der 10 wachstumsstärksten Länder weltweit liegen derzeit auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent. Aber es gibt das Problem natürlich überall, das Wirtschaftswachstum kommt allzu häufig oder allzu wenig bei den Menschen direkt und unmittelbar an. Auch dies ist eine Frage, die wir im Laufe dieses Forums, Herr Kapferer, miteinander mit Experten erörtern werden. Welche Art von Wirtschaftswachstum? Wem nützt es? Wem schadet es? Wie gestalten wir in Zukunft unsere Handelsbedingungen und Handelsverträge? Wie kann der Reichtum an Ressourcen, an Ideen und Kreativität für ein gutes Leben für die Menschen vor Ort eingesetzt werden? In unserem ersten Diskussionsforum geht es heute um einen internationalen Rahmen für nachhaltige Entwicklung. Herr Professor Köhler, Sie haben schon am Eingang darauf angesprochen, wir sind ja topaktuell sozusagen in der Schlussphase zur Vorbereitung der Erklärung der Staats- und Regierungschefs zu einem, wie ich es nenne, Weltzukunftsvertrag, wo wir uns, alle Staaten der Welt, auf eine verbindliche Ziele, auf eine neue Partnerschaft vereinbaren, die mehr sein müssen als eine Deklaration, eine feierliche, die einen erheblichen Grad an Verbindlichkeit aufweisen müssen. Wie gestalten wir eine nachhaltige und faire Globalisierung? Herr Präsident Mahama, Sie werden aus afrikanischer Sicht auf dieses Thema eingehen. Es ist mir eine besondere Freude, dann unseren ehemaligen Bundespräsidenten, Herrn Professor Köhler, als Referenten anzukündigen, als Mitglied des High-Level-Panels. Haben Sie diese universellen Ziele und diese Diskussion die letzten 20 Jahre und darüber hinaus, weiß ich, und ich hoffe, die nächsten 20 Jahre mit Blick in die Zukunft werden Sie diese Diskussion prägen. Sie mahnen uns dabei als Industrieländer und Politiker immer wieder, betrachtet Afrika als Partner auf Augenhöhe. Und das nehmen wir uns zu Herzen. Wir haben als besonderen Ehrengast heute, und begrüße Sie nochmal, Kofi Annan. Sie sind sicher einer der prominentesten Vertreter, Politiker, internationalen Gäste aus Afrika, der heute nicht nur bei so älteren Herren wie mir eine, hätte ich gesagt, Ikone ist, sondern auch bei den jungen Menschen heute das bekannte Gesicht nach wie vor Afrikas ist. Und als geschätzter früherer UN-Generalsekretär sprechen Sie zu uns und gehen dabei auch auf das Thema Afrika als künftiger kohlenstofffreie Supermacht ein. Bin sehr gespannt. Und Sie wissen, wir haben hier eine Reihe auch von gemeinsamen Projekten. Beim Ausbau erneuerbarer Energien hat Afrika eine riesige Chance, vom Kohlezeitalter, die Kohle schwarz, zum grünen Kontinent zu wachsen. Afrika hat alles, die Staaten, was erneuerbare Potenziale sind. Ein weiterer wichtiger Schritt ist deshalb diese 10-Gigawatt-Initiative, die wir auf den Weg gebracht haben. Im dritten Teil diskutieren wir, wie ländliche Regionen von der brodelnden wirtschaftlichen Dynamik profitieren können, die sich bisher viel zu oft nur in Großstädten abspielt. Mein Ministerium, wir werden im nächsten Jahr im Vorfeld der Habitat-3-Konferenz eine eigene Habitat-Konferenz durchführen. Wir sehen mit Sorge auch auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent den Sog in die großen Ballungszentren und Hunger auf dem Lande, dort, wo eigentlich die Nahrungsmittel vorhanden sind und wachsen. Wir können die Kleinbauern nicht zurücklassen. Leben allein auf die Städte zu konzentrieren, verursacht riesige Herausforderungen und Probleme, die wir gemeinsam lösen und angehen müssen. Aber wir müssen auch an die ländlichen Regionen denken, die Frage der Entwicklung von Zukunftsstrukturen für die Menschen auf dem Land. Es ist nicht nur modern, in der Stadt zu leben. Ich sage Ihnen, ich lebe auf dem Lande bewusst. Man lebt besser auf dem Land als in der Stadt wie hier in Berlin. Wenn ich entscheiden kann, lebe ich auf dem Land. Die bessere Luft, die freundlicheren Menschen und weniger Verkehr, bessere Wohnungen, ja. Und deshalb haben Sie uns als Partner auch für diese Themen. Lösungen für unsere Zukunft werden und können wir gemeinsam finden. Herr Kapferer, nochmal vielen herzlichen Dank der OECD, allen, die auch bei der Organisation mitbeteiligt waren. Wir freuen uns, dass Sie alle hier sind an einem wunderschönen sonnigen Tag hier in Berlin. Ich freue mich auf die Konferenz. Herzlich willkommen noch einmal.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, lieber Herr Minister Müller. Many, many thanks to Minister Müller for that resounding affirmation of Germany's commitment to strong relations with Africa and for reminding us that those relations provide a crucial foundation for seeking common solutions, for example, to the challenge of migration. Close and reliable partnership is also, of course, a central aim of the OECD, which is cooperating with individual African countries and with numerous regional organizations on a wide range of initiatives designed to promote investment, good governance, education, and transparency. All, of course, critical prerequisites for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that we will be signing in 2 weeks. Let us hear now from our second co-host, the Deputy Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Stefan Kapferer. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Melinda. You highlighted our work at the OECD so well that I'm just thinking about what can I add from the perspective of a Deputy Secretary General. Presidents, Prime Ministers, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, also welcome from my side, from the OECD, and Minister Müller, you made a few remarks about traffic jams in cities. I invite you to visit the OECD in Paris, and I'm sure you will be happy to come back to Berlin because the traffic jam in Paris is a stronger challenge. I want to first thank our friends, our traditional host, France, because it was mentioned twice by Minister Müller and also by Melinda Crane that traditionally this event happens in Paris. And it was always and also mentioned twice that the reason why we are here is that Germany is heading the G7 this year. And I think it's a great honor to be here, and it's a great pleasure. And thank you very much, Minister Müller. Thank you to your ministry and the whole German government for supporting this conference and hosting us this year. But I also want to thank our friends from France. The delegation is headed by the Secretary of State, Girardin. You contributed a lot in the last decades to this conference. And I think it is obvious in 2015 now that there was no year before where this connectedness, this interconnectedness of our societies, of our economies, of our states was so well recognized by people all over the world. And I think it's great that the OECD, the member countries of the OECD, the development center of the OECD, but also our friends from the African continent can work with this great experience we have made with this conference in the last few years. Many of you left Addis Ababa a few weeks ago talking about financing development. In 2 weeks, and it was also highlighted by Minister Müller, many of you will see each other again in New York to launch the Sustainable Development Goals. And at the end of November, beginning December, we will see each other again for mitigating and tackling the challenges of the climate change with COP21 in Paris. And I think what is different to earlier summits is that Africa, the African countries, is no longer a topic of these summits discussed between developed nations, between industrialized nations. The difference is now that the African countries, the African continent, is part of the group, of the international group, seeking solutions for these challenges, and I think this is a good news for all of us. And there are 2 reasons. One reason is that you find strategies to develop an agenda for economic prosperity in many of your countries. A lot of examples were highlighted by Minister Müller, and I think it is not necessary to come back to these examples by my side, but only to let you know the average GDP growth rate last year at the African continent was higher than the average GDP growth rate of the rest of the world. And we shouldn't forget that, because this is a clear signal. Economic prosperity is becoming stronger. You were able to foster growth by structural reforms, by improving the business environment, by improving good governance, and I think this is a good news for all of us. And it's very clear. There are some vulnerabilities, there are some threats for this process, always. Commodity prices, at the moment some questions about stability in some countries in the northern part of Africa. But like it was highlighted before, this is only a small part of the continent, and we have seen a lot of progress in the rest of the continent. And the second reason why Africa is a strong voice when we start with all these international summits now is that Africa was able to find a common position, to find a common voice for these summits. You all know that the Agenda 2063 is adopted. You all know that also the implementation plan for the first 10 years of this process is adopted between the African countries. And that means there's a clear commitment of the African countries, of the African states. What are our ideas? What is our contribution to improve the situation when we talk about tackling climate change or economic prosperity? And I think this is another very important step. You know that the OECD signed last year a memorandum of understanding with the African Union Commission. President Zuma and Secretary General Angel Gurria signed it last year. And the message of this memorandum of understanding is very clear. It's a message that we need this collaboration. It is focused on collaboration between the OECD, the Development Center of the OECD, the member countries of the OECD, and the African countries. And I'm also very thankful that the African Union Commission is funding for the second time this conference. I think although this is a clear proof that the situation has changed compared to earlier times. But the message of this Memorandum of Understanding, the main message of the Memorandum of Understanding is that we believe solutions for African challenges have to be designed by African governments and African societies. And that means the OECD does not believe that we are able to deliver the solutions. What we can deliver as OECD in our cooperation is a robust framework for peer-to-peer dialogue to think about what are the best solutions, what are best practices in other countries all over the world. The OECD is, and the Development Center of the OECD, is a bridge between our member countries and the African countries, is a bridge between also countries from Asia and Latin America and the African member countries to organize this kind of dialogue, to organize a process where we can share our expertise to find the best solutions for your regional challenges. And that's what we all wanted to organize. You know that the message of the OECD is better policies for better lives. And that means thinking about green growth, thinking about inclusive growth, thinking about education, good governance, and many other issues highlighted before. I'm sure that this conference, when we talk about the impact of the climate change to agriculture, when we talk about the question, how can we organize that annually 29 million young people entering the labor market will find jobs? Is regional development maybe the right idea for that? If we discuss all these today, I think we will have a great opportunity to develop together better policies for better lives. Once again, thank you all for being here, for discussing these topics with us, and I'm sure that this will be a very successful conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks to you, Stefan Kapferer, for, again, reminding us of the strong commitment that the OECD has made to working together with African countries and with African regional institutions. And it is my very great pleasure now to introduce our first keynote speaker of the morning. As we mentioned, it is so important at this forum that we do discuss amongst each other how we can find solutions both to our short-term and our long-term challenges. And certainly our first keynote speaker is a man who is very committed to doing so and who has dedicated much of his life and much of his effort to working on those solutions. It is a great honor to introduce our guest of honor at this conference, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana.
Your Excellencies, thank you. Your Excellencies, Prime Minister Jean Ravalomanarivo of Madagascar, I hope I got it right. Professor Horst Kohler, former President of the Federal Republic of Germany. My friend Dr. Gerd Müller, Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development. Guest of honor, Mr. Kofi Annan. The high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. Mr. Stefan Kapferer, who just gave us a very comprehensive talk. Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking you for this gracious invitation and the very warm welcome I have received since I arrived here in Berlin. It's always been a pleasure to be in Berlin, and the weather is very beautiful this morning. It is, however, a distinct honor for me to be here with you today to discuss the Common African Position on the post-2015 development agenda. And in fact, I can think of no better place and no better time for this discussion to happen than right here and right now in Berlin. When I received your invitation to speak on the CAP post-2015, I wondered what you required me to do. Certainly, you did not require me to come and present a technical paper, because Mr. Lopez of UNECA is here, and all the technocrats from the AU who helped us to arrive at a common African position are here, and I'm sure they'll give you enough of the technical aspects of our common African position. And so the writer and historian in me took over. So if you hear poetry or prose or a political speech, that is the context in which this address has been written. A decade ago, former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl launched a book of his memoirs in which he recalled the years that led up to the reunification of Germany, as well as the signing of the Maastricht Treaty and the formation of the European Union. Chancellor Kohl referred to them as the fateful years, and he revealed that the achievements of those historic events was due to the trust and cooperation of his fellow world leaders. We were united, Chancellor Kohl said, not only by political respect for each other, but also by mutual sympathy as people. Not only by political respect for each other, but also by mutual sympathy as people. As I was preparing my notes for this address, dutifully detailing the 6 pillars that comprise the Common African Position, those words spoken by Chancellor Kohl kept surfacing in my thoughts. I kept returning to that concept of humanity, to that core sympathy that leaders must have not merely for one another, but also for their constituents and for all the citizens of this world as people. I kept returning to that image, that terrible image of a little boy in a red shirt and blue pants, his body washed ashore on a Turkish beach. A 3-year-old boy by the name of Aylan Kurdi, dead as a result of a dangerous journey that he and his family made in search of safety and the possibility of a better future. But one will ask, what does this have to do with Africa? You're probably wondering. It has everything to do with Africa. It has everything to do with Africa because that boy, that body that washed ashore, could so easily have been any of the huge number of African children whose lives have also been claimed by those same waters this year, as their families attempted to cross the Mediterranean onto European soil. On a different shore, at a different time, it could have been the body of 27-year-old Ibrahim Ba from Senegal, who died with 700 other refugees when their boats from Libya capsized in the middle of April this year. Or it could have been his neighbor who left the village, the same village, several weeks before Ibrahima, and is believed to have died as he tried to make his way across the Sahara Desert to North Africa to find and pay a trafficker to ferry him to some place, indeed any place inside the European Union. Since the beginning of this year, over 3,000 refugees have died trying to make the journey across the Mediterranean. A large number of these deaths have been African. In 2014, 280,000 refugees arrived at the borders of the European Union. By the end of this past August, the number of refugees for this year, 2015, had almost reached 350,000. Of that number, 7,000 have recently been granted refuge here in Germany. And I'll be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to applaud Germany for taking this admirable, humane, and ultimately controversial action in response to what is being described as the most significant refugee crisis since the Second World War. I know the political and social costs are very high. You see, the reason Chancellor Kohl's statement about the prelude to those historical events that took place in Europe during the 1980s and 90s came to mind and stayed in my mind is that I believe that these, again, are fateful days, weeks, and months. I believe that the trust, cooperation, and basic humanity of our world leaders now will chart a new and defining course in this crisis. So it is important as we discuss how to implement a post-2015 agenda to also investigate why we find ourselves here in the midst of this crisis in 2015. Because what is worth sustaining more than life itself? And for what are we developing our nations, if not the stability, prosperity, and dignity of our citizens' lives, and the fulfillment of our children's hopes, dreams, and ambitions? It is difficult to predict what will happen in the world tomorrow. Events are moving at a frightening pace. Just a while ago, it was the Arab Spring, then the Syrian conflict, then a missing Malaysian passenger jet, then it was the conflict in Ukraine, then ISIS, then Charlie Hebdo, and now the migrant or refugee crisis. We took down a wall right here in Berlin, the Berlin Wall. Will the world put up new walls? Maybe, I don't know. It is a testament of our faith in our common humanity that we're meeting this year in New York to launch a post-2015 agenda, when it is difficult to even guess what will happen in the next 3 months before this year draws to a close. The Common African Position, or CAP for short, was created by the African heads of states under the auspices of the African Union in order that we can speak with one voice and act in unity to ensure that Africa's voice is heard and is fully integrated into the global development agenda. The CAP is made of 6 pillars, and these are structural economic transformation and inclusive growth, science, technology, and innovation, people-centered development, environmental sustainability, natural resource management, and disaster risk management, peace and security, finance, and partnership. Although each of these pillars contains its own set of sub-goals that are specific to that particular area of focus, non-performance or an intrusion to the rate of performance in any one of those pillars can greatly impact the efficacy of the work being done in other areas. This is especially true when countries already in tenuous positions, as many African countries find themselves, are faced with unforeseen disasters. We witnessed this last year with the sudden outbreak of the Ebola virus disease, which quickly spread across borders and claimed the lives of thousands of West Africans. But the epidemic claimed more than just the lives of those infected with the virus. It also claimed the livelihoods of those who were not infected. The epidemic took a tremendous toll on the labor force. Fear of exposure, voluntary as well as mandatory quarantines brought everything to a standstill, affecting even the harvest and thus the food supply. The revenue expected from tourism also experienced a steep decline as flights stopped operating to those affected countries and prospective visitors and business people altered their travel plans. Another thing to bear in mind when discussing the CAP is the potential effect of climate change on African nations. Take, for example, the fact that specialists have predicted that this year's El Nino, the annual climate phenomenon that occurs along the equatorial Pacific and impacts weather patterns across the globe, will be the strongest on record. There's a very likely possibility of flooding on the eastern coast of Africa. If that happens, it will be impossible to gauge the effect it will have on countries like Kenya and Tanzania, which just experienced mass flooding in May that left hundreds homeless, killed large numbers of livestock, and destroyed staple crops such as maize and cotton. Droughts have also long plagued various regions of the African continent, and with the effects of climate change, many nations are losing large percentages of their crop capacity. This will increase food shortages in areas that are already grappling with critical levels of hunger and extreme poverty. In and of themselves, such situations are difficult and destabilizing enough, as residents contend with the overburdening of infrastructure, the shortage of resources, loss of income, and shifts in population due to displacement or relocation. Unfortunately, such situations and their aftermath also then function as unhinging stresses that lower morale and tear at the very fabric of society. The sense of community and belonging that encourages a diverse group of people to coexist and to devote their individual efforts to the larger common good. And those rifts in the social fabric become the perfect entry points for people and groups whose intent it is to divide and wreak havoc. Political dissidents and terrorist organizations such as Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Kenya, Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, and the Central African Republic, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And as we all know, terrorism is a threat to the entire world, not just the region in which it first takes root. I wish also to speak to the issue of governance, because Africa has long been stereotyped as a continent of corrupt, repressive, and sometimes violent dictators. Despite the consistent spread of democracy as a result of free and fair elections and the institution of rule of law in many nations, that perception of Africa still persists. While it is true that there's conflict and political instability in several countries, especially in North Africa, as a result of the uprisings and ensuing civil turmoil, the continent of Africa is by and large politically stable. Still, many of the democracies are relatively new and as such vulnerable to the threats posed by terrorism and other forms of rebellion. It is not my intention to paint a picture of gloom, but in understanding why we find ourselves here today in the midst of this massive refugee crisis, in formulating strategies for sustainable development beyond this moment and this crisis, we must examine all the factors. We must take into consideration everything that might compel individuals wishing to escape their circumstances to risk their lives and the lives of their families to run the gauntlet. We must take into account that these are the same factors with which we must contend if we are to truly meet the goals outlined in the Common African Position. All of these issues notwithstanding, there has been much progress on the African continent, progress that is worthy of celebration. There's much promise to be fulfilled. The African continent is in the midst of a tremendous transformation. Then again, so is the rest of the world, and which is why dialogues such as this forum are so crucial. I'd like to close my address with the words of one of my personal and political heroes, the late Nelson Mandela. President Mandela said, "Our human compassion binds us, the one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future." It is imperative in these urgent times that we lead with compassion, with humanity, and with the courage to fight, to create and sustain the world we want. And so the question we must ask ourselves is that in these current fateful days, as Helmut Kohl said, as leaders and people, are we united by our political respect for each other and our mutual sympathy for each other? I thank you for your kind attention.
Many thanks to His Excellency President Mahama for those very stirring, very moving words, and also for reminding us that this forum and our partnership between Africa and the European countries offer us a truly important opportunity to shape the outcome of these fateful years ahead of us. Many thanks for that. We'd move on now to a second keynote from a leader who's had a couple of fateful years of his own. As Minister Müller reminded us, he served on the high-level eminent panel of a panel of eminent persons appointed by the UN Secretary General, which helped put together the set of recommendations that form the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals. So he must be feeling a great sense of fulfillment as he looks ahead to the signing of those goals 2 weeks from now. His experience with Africa was forged not only in his terms as director of the International Monetary Fund and president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but it also helped to set his priorities when he served as president of the Republic of Germany. It is a very great pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Professor Dr. Horst Köhler.
Oops. Well, Mr. President, thank you also from my side for your impressive speech. Mr. President, sehr geehrter Bundesminister, dear Mr. Kapferer, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to take a short walk with me. To get to our destination, we have to leave this building and turn left, then walk westwards on the Französische Straße, the French street, for around 900 meters. Then we take a left turn into the Wilhelmstraße. After 150 meters, we stop at number 92. This is the place where exactly 130 years ago the Berlin Conference came to its end. Just about 1,000 meters from where we are now, European colonial powers agreed on how to split up the African continent without getting too much into each other's way, laying the foundation for decades of unimaginable exploitation that still reverberates today. Could there be a better place for us to meet and to reflect on the relationship between Africa and the OECD, an organization that was founded by the very nations that met for the Berlin Conference? I think that this is more than just an interesting twist of history. It is a reminder of our responsibility to be aware of our common, cruel past and to be vigilant for colonial attitudes still persisting today. If we look at the current challenges that inextricably bind us together, be it terrorism or the refugee crisis, being aware of the history of our relationship does not always make things easier. But it is a perspective that is needed if we want to find lasting solutions. The past, after all, is our most important teacher when it comes to learning for the future. The future is what I would like to talk about. 2 weeks from now, the General Assembly of the United Nations will adopt the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, until now better known under the working title Post-2015 Agenda. It is a comprehensive action plan of 17 goals and 169 targets, which member states pledge to reach until 2030. As with any plan that is finalized after a long period of negotiation, the critics are already getting in position. Too ambitious, cry the realists. Not ambitious enough, cry the idealists. And most probably, many critics don't care enough to cry anything, convinced that this is just another useless United Nations plan heading for the dustbin of history. Now, of course, the list of legitimate criticism about the Sustainable Development Goals is long. I myself get a headache when I hear the number of 169 targets. But we must not lose out of sight that this is a compromise, that a compromise by definition is imperfect, and that neither could it be anything else than a compromise. taking into account that 193 governments had to agree to this agenda, and thousands of stakeholders had been consulted in a process that took several years. So rather than engaging in a detailed analysis of what I think is right and what is wrong about this new agenda, I'm inviting you to look for the consensus that is hidden in this compromise. What do all the nations in the world agree on? Let me point out the two answers that are, in my view, the most important. First, the nations of this world agree that we can eradicate extreme poverty in the lifetime of one generation. For the first time in the history of mankind, this is within our reach, for we have all knowledge, all the technology, and all the wealth that is needed to end extreme poverty once and for all. To all those who say that this is a vision too far-reaching, I say, we know how to eradicate poverty. We can eradicate poverty. And it would have been an act of political cowardice not to commit that we will eradicate poverty. Second, the nations of this world agree that in order to eradicate poverty, we must not destroy our planet. This means that any agenda for people and planet must be for the whole world, must stipulate change everywhere, in the north and the south, the east and the west. This is probably the major difference of this new agenda compared to the now famous Millennium Development Goals. And you achieved a lot, Kofi, with these Millennium Development Goals. The MDGs were based on the premise that it is the developing countries, at least most, that have a problem, and saw the role of industrialized countries in helping the poorer nations to overcome these problems. The SDGs are saying, as long as no country in the world has found a way to reconcile economic prosperity with ecological sustainability, we all have a problem. We are all developing countries. Therefore, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a universal agenda. Many of its goals, from women's rights to energy efficiency, are relevant for rich and poor countries alike. I believe that this principle of universality could be a true catalyst for change in international relations. I know that in the process of developing the Sustainable Development Goals, there were oftentimes worries, especially on the part of Africans, that universality means less focus on poverty, that development efforts for those who are most in need would get diluted. At a time when there are still 750 million people without access to safe drinking water, those critics may have asked, can the development community really afford to worry about the state of renewable energy in Germany? Of course, I agree that we must never lose our focus on eradicating extreme poverty. Giving each and every individual on this earth the chance of living a life in dignity must never be anything else but priority number one. And yet, it is this very focus on poverty that makes the strongest case for a universal agenda. How could we effectively combat extreme poverty if we didn't finally and fundamentally address the structural causes? Can we really talk about land degradation or desertification without talking about the production and consumption patterns contributing to global warming? Can we really talk about food security without also talking about the existing unfairness in our international trade system? Can we really talk about industrialization and job creation in Africa, which is desperately needed, without admitting that this can only be successful if it is supported by structural reforms in already industrialized countries? The links between sustainability and prosperity are, on a global scale, so strong and so manifold that it would be naive to ignore them. The SDGs, imperfect as they may be, are an expression of those links. Goals that require change everywhere are therefore not taking away from the fight against extreme poverty, but are the only sound foundation for that fight. Furthermore, goals that require change everywhere are not only the right policy, they could also bring an important change of mindset to international relations, a sense of interdependence, of common interest, of mutual accountability. They could bring a new spirit of global partnership to world politics. Perhaps nowhere else is such a spirit as sorely needed as in the relation of Africa with industrialized countries. Historically, there has been an underlying attitude of cultural superiority of the Western world towards Africa. Today, this sense of superiority is less fueled by racism as it was at the time of the Berlin Conference. It is rather the arrogance of a system which knows it has brought unprecedented prosperity to its people, an achievement that is envied for. But for how long will the West be able to feel superior, given that this prosperity is based on a lifestyle that brings the planet to the brink of disaster? If everyone would consume the resources of this earth at the rate of the Europeans or Americans, we would need several planets in reserve. For how long will anyone be able to be proud of that? In that sense, the universal ambition of the SDGs is also an exercise in humility. Nobody has all the answers. We are all in search of solutions. There are two conclusions I draw from this. One is about the concept of development and development cooperation, and the other one is about our understanding of African modernity. First, could this humility perhaps give rise to a new concept of development, a concept based on the huge transformation that resource scarcity and climate change are imposing on us all, rich or poor? Such a concept of development as transformation everywhere, could, for all the existing asymmetries in economic and political power, facilitate a partnership of imperfect equals, free of paternalism and condescension. The world as a community of learners. We are all learners. There is an African proverb that sums this up pretty well. Beware of the naked man who offers you clothes. Shouldn't the naked man of the North think more profoundly about the purpose of the economy, the definition of well-being, and the limits of growth before offering their clothes to others? This also means that we need to have a profound discussion about our system of international aid. One must be careful that we do not talk on Sundays about universal goals that make us all developing countries in need of transformation. And then on Mondays, we continue an aid system that perpetuates the old power imbalances between donors and recipients. There's a fine line between solidarity and charity. Don't get me wrong, please. I don't believe that development cooperation has become superfluous. Quite to the contrary. But we have to focus again on the cooperation part. And we have to overcome our obsession with money. This may sound strange from the mouth of a former head of the IMF, but we know from 40 years of development assistance that the problem is often not a lack of money, often not a lack of money, but a lack of political will and political leadership. A lack of political will and political leadership on all sides of the table. So let's free our collective political creativity again. Let's get past the decades-old rituals of negotiation where sometimes one gets the impression that the positions are no more sophisticated than I need more money on the one hand, and I'm not paying for that on the other side. Isn't it time that we find an understanding of common but differentiated responsibility that is fit for the realities of the 21st century? I cannot hide my disappointment that the Addis Conference on Financing for Development in July has brought only little progress on this matter. And if the reports are true, sorry, Mr. Kapferer, then the OECD member states, unfortunately, did not play a very constructive role in trying to implement change, for example, in the area of international tax policy or combating illicit capital flows. There's a second conclusion that I draw from the kind of humility that comes with realizing that change is needed everywhere, not just in the South. Could this pave the way to an understanding of African modernity, which is not just a copy of something else? A modernity defined not as the culmination of a linear development towards technology-based prosperity measured by GDP, the way in which most in the West understand prosperity, but as something pluralistic, evolving in multiple directions, a juxtaposition of the local and the global, of tradition and innovation. In short, an African modernity sui generis. In one chapter of the wonderful memoirs of your childhood and youth, Mr. President, I read it indeed. You write about your 2 years of studies, amongst others, in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I will skip the part where you tell the reader how you learned to drink vodka Russian style. I skip it. You write how your confrontation with the reality of socialism, with perestroika and glasnost, made you not to believe in absolutes anymore, made you realize that neither of the superpowers had the answers, and that Ghana and Africa would have to find their own way, would have, your quote, to grow and learn on their own terms. I agree. A presidential colleague from Africa once said to me, "You have to let us make our own mistakes even." And I again agree. But Making mistakes is only helpful if one also draws the necessary conclusions. 50 years of making mistakes and progress and of learning have passed since the time African countries gained their formal independence. And yet, for all the positive developments in many African countries and the continent, the AU as a whole, and I totally agree with this summing up, the process of Africa finding its own voice, its inner independence, its own modernity, is moving forward for me too slowly. And it's being hampered not only from outside Africa, but possibly primarily from Africa within. Too many African leaders are still holding their own people hostage. Too many African leaders are using self-victimization as an excuse for their own wrongdoings. Too many African leaders are still blaming Western hypocrisy only to hide their own. There is nothing African about corruption, nothing African. And there is nothing un-African about the rule of law. And the leader who uses anti-colonialism as a smokescreen for his creed is insulting his own people. And why is it that some African governments seem oblivious to the fact that so many young people, their young people, are risking their lives to flee their countries? What is their big idea, their big effort, their New Deal for offering perspectives for the youth? And Mr. President, that is no excuse for our misbehavior in the industrialized world. I just want to be clear about that. You should not misunderstand me. I know that many Africans are working hard to hold their own leaders accountable, and that many African institutions are supporting governments in taking real responsibility for the fate of their nations. For example, I talked to NEPAD, the African peer review mechanism. I see here Mr. Lopez. These are people who have the right thinking. My hope is that those positive forces of change grow stronger faster. Because without Africa taking matters in its own hands and showing true leadership on the global stage, there's no way the vision of eradicating poverty until 2030 will get even close to being reached. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in uncertain times, clearly. One truth, however, is certain. What happens in one part of the world has its effects on other parts of the world. A stock market crash in China sends shockwaves to Frankfurt, London, and New York. An Ebola outbreak in West Africa puts hospitals all over the world in high alert. A civil war in Syria turns a train station in Budapest into a refugee camp. The world is interconnected and interdependent as never before, and there is no turning back. Allow me to make some closing remarks about the refugee crisis that is moving us in most parts of Europe these days. And your speech, the first part, as a historian and writer, was in particular impressive. To begin with, let's remember, ladies and gentlemen, that crisis is in the first place not the word for what is happening in Europe, but for what's happening in the Sahel zone, in North Africa, in Middle East. There is the crisis. That's where the real crisis is taking place, far away from the daily news headlines with us. Let's also remember that the crisis has been going on for a long time and that it was foreseeable. And so we have to ask ourselves, what else has to happen for Europe to realize that it needs a fundamentally different approach towards Africa and the Middle East? What else? For some people here in Europe, the pictures of masses of refugees desperately trying to cross borders feel like an outside world, suddenly creeping through the cracks of the walls we have built around our world of comfort and safety. But here's the deal. There is no outside world. There never has been an outside world. Europe has been and will always be part of this one world, with all its terrors and all its wonders. Therefore, Europe and everybody else must finally go beyond the quick fix solutions, driven not least by media cycles. She must take a long-term view and must address the fundamental challenges that are threatening the future of our children in the South and the North. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is, in my view, an historic opportunity for such a long-term effort and new approach. If the current crises concern you and all of us, then we should take this agenda seriously. Then we should view it as a declaration of interdependence, a declaration of interdependence for the 21st century. Its bottom line is, there is no outside world. We are all in one boat. We must all be accountable to each other. And despite our differences, we all reach for the same: a dignified future for our children on a healthy planet. In order to achieve that, we all need to change. Thank you.
Many thanks to President Köhler. You have provided us with much food for thought, much food for discussion. We will be picking up on a number of your questions and topics throughout the day in our panels, but I'm happy to say that all of our panelists will be fully clothed. There will be no naked men offering clothing on our panels. Many thanks to you. Some of our leaders must leave us now for a brief conversation with the press, but we, ladies and gentlemen, are continuing straight away with our first panel discussion. So I will say thank you very much to all of our speakers so far, and perhaps one last warm round of applause to them before they do leave us. And as I say, we will now, in our first panel discussion, be picking up on all of the subjects that were raised by our speakers, and particularly looking at the synergies between the Sustainable Development Goals and the long-term African initiatives which were mentioned by President Mahama in his speech. How can these far-reaching objectives best be turned into concrete action? And what are the implications, not only for African policymakers, but also for their international partners, for the OECD? That's our subject in the panel. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our guests. Last year, as you heard, the OECD Development Center signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the African Union Commission, and it won them as partners for the forum. So we are especially glad to have with us here today the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Now serving his second term, he has promoted a continental agenda and strengthened internal institutional mechanisms aimed at improving AUC effectiveness. He previously served for 10 years as Secretary General of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, helping make it the largest free trade area in Africa. A very warm welcome, if you would please, ladies and gentlemen, for His Excellency Erastus J.O. Mwencha. If you would take this seat right here, please. Thank you very much. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Wonderful that he also could join us today. His long career at the UN has included senior leadership posts as Executive Director of the Institute for Training and Research, as Director for Political Affairs in the Executive Office of the SG, and as UN Resident Coordinator in Zimbabwe and Brazil. A pleasure to welcome His Excellency Dr. Carlos Lopez. If you will take that seat on the outside right there. Thank you very much. And our final guest is Director of the OECD Development Center. It has been mentioned here a number of times today. It promotes exchange among governments, business, and civil society organizations on innovative solutions to global development challenges. He previously served as Deputy Director of the OECD's Public Governance and Territorial Development Directorate and as head of its Regional Policy Division. Please welcome Mario Pizzini. Excellency, Mr. Mwencha, I want right away to talk about those long-term, those crucial long-term initiatives that were mentioned several times here today, both the Agenda 2063 and the Common African Position. But allow me perhaps a very brief question on the short-term challenge that we face. And I refer, of course, to the migration crisis. It was mentioned here several times already, so I'll ask you to just say a few very brief words regarding your own view of this crisis and what can be done short-term to deal with it. It's on.
Thank you very much. Maybe before I speak on that very topic, let me use this opportunity to say how happy we are to be co-hosts of this event, and also to thank our partner, the OECD and the Center, for this great partnership. As you said in your introduction remarks, we did sign a memorandum of understanding last year, and we see the great benefit out of it. Now, straight to the subject. I think President Cole has put the subject very squarely, that we live in a world that is interconnected but also interdependent. And this phenomenon perhaps is only being seen partially in putting rightly as he put it, because the cameras are focusing on those huge numbers that are arriving in the shores of Europe. But this is a change, this is a force that has been gathering momentum for a time. We are only seeing now that force because the gates are broken, floods are starting to come out. But we haven't seen the bottom of it all yet if we don't act. And this is the time to act. Basically, there are 2-3 things that we need to look at. One is, what are the push factors that lead to this kind of phenomenon that we see? What are the pull factors? We need to be sober, analyze them critically, squarely, globally, that we can address it. Not between Europe and Africa, not game plan, but look at what are the issues that we need to address. 2-3 things surface very clearly. One, if you look at what is happening, it is really search of opportunities. Search of opportunities for those that are running away. But there needs to be trigger for this then to become a mass movement. And the triggers are things like failed state. If you look at where these individuals are coming from, it is countries that you would categorize as failed state if you are looking at refugees. But there is a phenomenon that is not really being highlighted, and those are migrants that is slowly trickling in, but at the end of the day, add to numbers. So we need to look at both sides of the equation in terms of refugees and migrants. Now, looking at the issues of migrants, fortunately, between Europe and Africa, we've been talking about this, in fact, since 2006. But it has remained a game of good intentions. Fortunately, there is an upcoming summit in Valletta where we had already planned to meet to discuss this matter in detail. And now this crisis has given us an opportunity for us to look at it squarely. What is it that we need to do? In the first instance, I'm happy again to indicate that as gathering momentum for this event in Valletta, for instance, yesterday, we had a good exchange of information and views with Foreign Minister Steinmeier. Today you hear Minister Müllers also develop this further. Now, for us, Germany has shown leadership in tackling this. And we hope that Germany, working with these partners in Europe, will continue to work on this. From the African perspective, we have developed a common position on this very matter. So when we meet in Valletta, we should be able to look at it in that context. There are two areas that we need to look at. There are short-term measures, but we must also develop long-term measures. One of the fundamental challenges that come about is the negative approach that has been that if we don't create instruments that allow refugees, that allow mechanisms for people to move, then they use these unorthodox means. So let's look at all these broad issues. But from the African perspective, 2-3 things need to be underlined. We need economic transformation, that we can absorb those 29 million youths that enter the market. And I think this is the case that could be applied everywhere. But therefore, we need to act together in that context of understanding that we are in one boat. And yes, there is an opportunity for us to meet and for us to be able to tackle this matter, which is crucial, but which has been gathering momentum over the years.
Many of those long-term objectives are, of course, enshrined in the Agenda 2063 and also in the Common African Position. This year, the African Union adopted its first 10-year implementation plan looking toward concrete implementation of the Agenda 2063. You are known for results-based approaches, so I'd like very much to know, what do you see as the next concrete steps that need to be taken, and how do you plan to monitor results and follow-up?
Thank you very much. And again, I must be so grateful for the presentation by President Mahama, so I'm not going to repeat what has been eloquently done. Now, yes, we have adopted the universal goals of Agenda 2063. These were done in the context of Africa looking at the last 50 years, but also looking at the next 50 years. So 2063 actually stands for the next 50 years, right from 2013, when Africa achieved or was 50 years since the gaining of independence that was mentioned here this morning. In articulating that, Africa was looking at how do we transform our economies beyond what we have done in the last 50 years so that Africa doesn't remain doing the same thing that has been done for 50 years and for which we have seen has not changed the African context. Now, what are the concrete steps therefore? Two elements come out of this agenda. There is the Agenda 2053, which would be long-term, is universal. There is a lot of acceptance in terms of consultations and domestication. But we have drawn out of that 6 goals that have to be implemented in the next 10 years. And those, in terms of concrete ones, we're looking at specific goals that are actionable. One, for instance, on issue of integration. Again, it is important that we are here in Berlin, where, as again President Kohl mentioned this morning, we come back to the issue of the potential for Africa to gain its growth. We must have integration squarely as a fundamental goal for us to pursue. And here we are looking at issues like trade, and one of the most important issues that is coming up, by 2017, we are determined that we launch a continental free trade area. That will also enable Africa to maximize the use of resources, but also to open and potential for the 1.2 billion people that live in the continent to create a large market that can be able to have sustainable development. The second one, and which is emerging very high on the African continent, is infrastructure. Today, Africa needs close to $100 billion for investment. The question is, where is this going to come from? Africa sees opportunity to mobilize some of this internally. And again, it was mentioned. We have mechanism for Africa to raise these resources. But we are also opening for partnership with the rest of the world to come and invest, and Africa is creating this favorable environment for you to come and invest. The transformation that we are talking about has to be in the area of science, technology, and innovation. But that cannot happen without us looking at the skills, the human skills, which is extremely important. In that context, in Africa, we have established a Pan-African university program, but where we want to invest now is to massify skills, and skills looking at areas like science, engineering, technology, mathematics, so that we can have skills that will be used in the economic transformation. The third area is in the area of governance, peace and security. Again, it has been mentioned here, practically. Africa now, in the last 10 years, is largely peaceful. Only 5% of Africans live in what you might call war zones or troublesome zones. But there is every effort to harness this. If we harness this, then Africa's image, which again is also one that has affected Africa, getting out of the loop of an area not to invest in, will be diminishing, that Africa will emerge as a partner for investment. And so these are concrete steps that we need to take in terms of implementation, but looking at it from 3 points of view. First, the transformation, which must take place, moving agriculture, moving industry, industrialization being the center. Second, human capital development skills. And the third, science and technology, for which we need to invest massively for transformation of the continent.
Let me pick up on two of those points mentioned also by several other speakers today, skills and employment. Agenda 2063, Mr. Lopez, foresees that youth unemployment will be eliminated. That is a very tall order indeed, given Africa's burgeoning population. The Africa Economic Outlook of the OECD stresses that some 29 million new jobs would need to be created every year from now until 2030 to absorb new entrants into the workforce. That is an enormous challenge. How do we get there?
Well, I must say something about the two speeches that we received. Both President Mahama and President Kola went deep into history, and I was really gratified with their interventions. They were very powerful statements. And I think because of the weight of history, one has to approach these targets with a certain degree of modesty. And President Kola used the word humility. And I think this humility is necessary, but we can start by the recent past. I will not dwell in the long history, but at least the recent past, the last 15 years. We tripled GDP in the last 15 years. There is only one region historically in the world that has been able to have such a performance. It's a stellar performance before. And I'm talking historically. That is China. So this is remarkable. But as it was also mentioned by President Kola, it shows the limits of measuring our progress with GDP. The challenges that you are mentioning are precisely the challenges that we face that require economic structural transformation. And that economic structural transformation is basically defined in 3 areas. The first area is the fact that we continue to depend too much for our exports, for our revenues coming from our trade, on extractive industries. Extractive industries are responsible for 1% of Africa's employment. Are we going to continue with that? Is this going really to change our fortunes? No. Unless we add value to these raw materials, we are basically not benefiting from these exports. We are exporting the jobs. How do we reverse this is fundamental. The second point is that we have 2/3 of our workforce that are in agriculture. Agriculture that is the least productive in the world, that has not made major strides, except in the last 10 years. Productivity is so low that we can equate our poverty with the fact that 2/3 are in low productivity agriculture. Unless we change agriculture productivity, we are not going to have the 29 million, not even close. And the only way we can get there is by making sure that there are pull factors that are going to transform Africa's agriculture. And the number one pull factor is going to be industrialization. It's through agro-processing, modernization of agricultural production that we are going to exercise a pull factor, the right incentives, and all the rest, including the push for infrastructure investment that was mentioned by the Deputy Chairperson, Mwencha. And then the third factor is that we are basically experiencing a growth that is based on consumption. 2/3 of our growth, not of our GDP, of our growth is coming from internal consumption. That is unsustainable. And the only way we are going to change it is by changing the pattern and the structure of our economies that is now getting most of the new value from services. And most of these services are depending on basically informal sector. Unsustainable. So people have occupations, not jobs. People have vulnerable lifestyles, not sustainable lifestyles. So unless we change all of this, we are not going to get there. Now, I think there is a plan. We have a plan in the continent. And that plan is encapsulated in a number of common frameworks and targets. But it is important that we are not overwhelmed by the SDGs. Why? Because they have 169 targets. To find our own in the middle of 169 is daunting. So that's why the Africans have to have their own priorities within that list. And that is a process that is on course. And the heads of state have identified the need for African development goals. They will not be in contradiction with universal ones, but they will set the priorities right for the Africans and will make sure that Africa comes first. You know, I like to use this slogan, Africa first, all the time. And 2 weeks ago, on my way to boarding a plane in Addis Airport, I saw an Ethiopian Airlines plane with the name Africa First. And I was very excited because I thought that somehow the slogan that I've been used had been copied. So I spoke with the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines and said, well, I'm very happy that you gave the name of this plane Africa First, because that's exactly what we should do. We should promote this idea, this slogan. And then he looked at me very surprised and said, but that's not the reason we call it Africa First. We call it Africa First because it's the first Africa Dreamliner. And I was very disappointed. But then I reflected for a minute and said, wait a minute, what a wonderful metaphor. Africa First is a nice dream line.
So, Mario Pezzini, where are the biggest challenges to turning that dream into reality? And what can the Development Center do to help? We've heard here this morning the solutions need to come from Africa itself, but what can you do to help overcome challenges, obstacles that are out there?
I would like to make 2 points. One is strongly inspired by the keynote speaker this morning, and in particular the idea that we should be in a permanent learning process. Because if we have common targets, we have heard now my colleague here, we are different in certain aspects, and we learn from this difference, and it's a crucial resource in a certain sense. And therefore, how can we, in the implementation of SDGs or in the implementation of the objectives for development, learn from previous experiences? Together with Carlos, what we are doing in October is to sit down in Addis Ababa and call Latin American countries and African countries to discuss what they have done in order to put in place this industrialization, so needed in Africa because of the dependence of natural resources, but also so needed in Latin America, where dependence is very similar in that respect. Learning from the different experiences means avoiding failures, sometimes copying, but sometimes getting source of inspiration to make dreams become true. What the Development Center is doing by nature is exactly that thing. We have 49 members, 27 are OECD countries, 22 are not OECD countries, and there is China, Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, there is Egypt, there is Morocco, there is Senegal, Ivory Coast, and many others. It's extraordinary to have these countries around the table and to learn from the different experiences what to do in policy making and in designing strategies. Because I agree with Carlos, the SDGs push us to a next step, more in-depth, wide, taking into account not only objective of growth or reducing poverty, but also of improving well-being. But the map is very wide. We are in Google 1 meter explosion. There is a need to figure out a GPS. How we draw from here to the objective that has been set in a way which is appropriate for each individual country. And how can we build this more, not simplified, but more clear, specific strategies that is required? There is no recipe. We have learned from the experiences of Washington Consensus that the decalogue of equal rules for everybody do not work. So how do we discover the new perspective? It's with the country, discussing between peers. They have to recognize they are peers. That's absolutely fundamental. And we, together with our friends, we try to build this table in which we learn from each other and then accompany each other in their own specific experience. Strategies are much needed today. And allow me to say one word now, the second point about Africa. My friends here, they said in several ways that there is a big opportunity and challenge for Africa, extraordinary one, is the increasing population that will double from now to 2050. You quoted our report. Many young people will come in the labor market and in the society. And this is an extraordinary opportunity. China passed through it, India passed through it, they use it in an extraordinary way. But it could be a course, if that great thing, that means that if today every young people is bringing an old person in Africa on the shoulder, which is heavy, particularly if the person has my weight characteristics, tomorrow there will be more young people capable to bring the old in their shoulder. But what if they don't have a job? What if they don't have a decent job? Let me quote an example. There is a country in North Africa that for 10 years had 5% of growth every year. A country where the enrollment in primary school is 100% and was 100%. Very high level of enrollment in secondary school. Deficit, minus 3%. I mean, something that many European countries would like to have. Debt, 42.8%. Which country I'm talking about? Tunisia before the Arab Spring. So perfect under the traditional lenses of an economist. Tunisia exploded because it was necessary but not sufficient. We need to integrate these young people in society, and this requires, for sure, skills. But in the case of Tunisia, they had some. There was no job for those skills. Here comes the crucial point of Carlos. We need to transform the economy to be not only capable to produce skills, but also to absorb those skills. Therefore, the productive transformation is crucial because this is, under my point of view, the major challenges in the year to come.
Thanks very much. We have very limited time, but I have just two brief questions, and I'll ask for very, very brief answers, if you would, please, as well, because I'm mindful, I've got an eye on the clock. But I would like to ask about resource mobilization, because it was mentioned here already today. Clearly, the SDGs are going to require unprecedented resources. Huge subject in Addis Ababa, of course, domestic resource mobilization. Bearing in mind, and we heard it again from President Köhler, that taxation is an issue that also must be addressed internationally and has not been adequately addressed to date. Nonetheless, domestically, for African countries, what can you do domestically to improve tax systems, to mobilize those crucially needed resources? And again, a brief answer if you would.
Yeah, this is crucial because having the goals is one thing, but also having effective means of implementation is a crucial factor. This has not gone unattended to in the context of Africa. Indeed, in fact, the last summit that was held in Johannesburg was looking at this very issue on mobilizing resources for implementing our agenda. And that was coming on the heels of the summit that has taken place in Addis Ababa under the aegis of the UN on financing development. Now, a lot of studies that have been done on the continent do point out to potential for Africa to mobilize resources within Africa. If we look at the issue of tax base, if we look at illicit financial flows that are coming out of Africa, but also if we look at attracting investment within the continent itself, because Africa, if you look at the number of now investors from within the continent that are investing within Africa, it is growing in large numbers. And so promoting the private partnership within the continent is extremely important. But also, Africa doesn't remain oblivious to the fact that we welcome international capital to come as a supplement, because we need technology, particularly technology embedded capital. Yes, one study, if I could give you an example, that was carried under the aegis of ECA, indicated that in terms of illicit capital flows, Africa loses to the tune of $50 billion annually, more than $50 billion. Can you imagine? And all this is documented and clearly indicated that if we plugged these loopholes, Africa can have resources to implement. And so that is an area that is very much under discussion and is underway.
Mario Pizzini, I hope you'll excuse me if I jump over you and just note here what important work the OECD also is doing in this area in terms of capacity building on domestic taxation and the efficiency of domestic systems, because I very much would like to ask Dr. Lopez to say just a word or two about monitoring. We talked about it earlier, the crucial need to do really robust monitoring. Regional institutions have a crucial role to play going forward. Can you say something about the role of the ECA, please? And again, if you would, briefly.
Sure. Well, first of all, just to situate the debate philosophically, I think it's important for us to know that the journey to get to where we are, the Sustainable Development Goals and the integration of all the dimensions, economic, social, environmental, is a 45-year journey to get to where we are. And still, each time there is a crisis, we go back to the original, which is to give prominence to the economy as if the social and environmental is not important. The moment Europe got into a crisis, the first thing that was dealt with was to get rid of some green preoccupations. And then as the crisis deepened, it was affecting also the social gains and the state providence that existed. I call this the cappuccino approach. It's the cappuccino approach because you have the coffee, which is the basis, then you add a bit of milk, and then you sprinkle some cocoa on the top. And the moment you have a problem, you don't have the cocoa, but you still have a latte. But when you don't have the milk, you still can drink your coffee. And that's basically how we deal with economy. And this is exactly the way we do monitoring today. We give prominence to the economic dimensions and not to the other. How are we going to change this behavior? Well, I think with 169 targets, we have a tall order. But we have the experience of how the MDGs have created something extraordinary, which was policy space. It was mentioned by Mr. Mwencha when he said, well, you know, what was wonderful with all these efforts of the MDGs is that Africans got the possibility of actually concentrating on goals rather than on prescriptive policies. And Mario also mentioned it with the Washington Consensus. So now that we have acquired this policy space, goals instead of prescriptions, we cannot lose it. And not losing it means the monitoring system has to be in such a way that it keeps this policy space. And that's the work that we have to do.
That you have another experience to draw on, of course, also. It was mentioned here earlier, NEPAD and the African Peer Review Mechanism. How might that factor in moving forward?
The NEPAD experience and the APRM, the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, are very powerful tools to strengthen this idea of the Africa First, where Africans are the ones reviewing themselves. And it was acknowledged by the different agreements reached this year so far as a unique and very innovative way of dealing with monitoring issues. And I think we have to reinforce these mechanisms, and definitely when you look into the experience of the Africa Peer Review Mechanism now with 37 countries adhering to it, it's a very interesting expression of the Africans wanting to peer review themselves and making sure that people understand the best learning is the learning from your peer. It's exactly what Mario was saying. And it starts right in your neighborhood, and that's basically the idea.
Mr. Pizzini, I asked just now crucial next steps. What are the crucial next steps in your view for the Development Center in its work? Where do you see the most crucial areas of collaboration moving forward?
One thing is to analyze what is the general situation and trends of the economy, to discuss it as a think tank. But when you have the chance to have these countries around the table every day, together obviously with Hans, that is here the chair of this extraordinary body, well, what you need to discuss is the implementation of the action and the policies. And not to establish a pure evaluation, but a kind of learning by monitoring how these things are put in place. To do that, it's indispensable to create an atmosphere of trust, where everybody needs to perceive itself as being equal. And therefore, that's what we are doing. Together, we are discussing with NEPAD, together with NEPAD, to try to see how this peer review mechanism can go one step further. And therefore, being maybe used also in the perspective at national level of implementation and design of the strategy for development. This is our next step.
Let me just, before we close this discussion, ask all of you to say a brief word to the following. And we're talking about beyond 2015, so I'd like to look significantly beyond 2015. Some say, despite all of the reports that we do hear about short-term crises and perhaps that sometimes negative focus of my own branch of the media when they look at Africa, nonetheless, some say the 21st century, Mr. Mwencha, will be the African century. How likely is that projection in your view, and what would it mean? What would an African century look like?
We have done a scenario of how Africa should look like in 2063. And that scenario, of course, takes two fundamental principles into account. And I should say here that Africa is very much aware and taking advantage of the African proverb, which says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And that journey that we have started for the next 50 years is, first of all, to transform Africa from current state that is not sustainable. Africa that is industrialized, Africa that is capable of managing its own affairs, Africa that is peaceful, but Africa that has space in the community of nations. And all this will require, of course, not Africa going alone, but also Africa working in partnership. And in that, and what Mr. Lopez talked about, out of the 169, Africa found consensus, that's why we're going together, in carving out the Agenda 2063 that is very much in tune with universal goals, but which articulates enough space for Africa to act, but act in such a manner that we will flow together to achieve that objective, which is an expression of the people themselves that have said that is what they want. In fact, for some, they think it is too far, and some of those goals must be achieved even before that time. And that's why we have done this curve of 10 years so that we can harvest, making it practical for us to be able to reach that goal of a prosperous, peaceful Africa in 2063.
Dr. Lopez, perhaps you would share with us your vision as well, but I would be grateful if you would also refer briefly to climate change, because certainly that is going to be a reality of the coming century in Africa. It's already reality in many countries, including Madagascar. So if you would also share your experience in the context of looking ahead toward an African century, I would be grateful.
Well, a bit over 300 years ago, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract. And the idea behind this seminal contribution for the world's thinking was, let's move the solidarity from a family level to a community level. Now you have to have a pact between the various members of the community in order to make progress. And he said this is only possible by having also a contract with nature. Your point about climate change. Well, what we are discussing today, and from the presentation of President Kohler, you got it in a very dramatic and very appealing way, is a social contract for this century. It's a social contract that is no longer based on the movement from a family to a community solidarity, but planet solidarity, the entire world solidarity. And if we are going in that direction, that's what the SDGs point. Let's look into how the population is going to look. Let's say in 2040. In 2040, Africa will have the largest workforce in the world, will surpass China and India. By 2040, there will be close to 100,000 people in Japan alone over 100 years old. And how are they going to survive? And Europe will not be too far. How is Europe going to survive? They will not be able to survive without the energy, the strength, and the contribution of Africa. That's why Africa is indeed the continent of the 21st century. It starts by the fact that demographically, it's the continent that is going to offer its youthness to the aging population of many parts of the world. That is a new form of social contract. And we have to be prepared for it. Psychologically, in terms of identity, it's a very, very important preparation we need. And if we are going to do that, then we'll be able to understand that if Africa is going to have 30% of the world's population, it will not be possible on those times for Africa to have the contribution to the world economy that it has today. This is not sustainable. So whatever boats we are seeing in the Mediterranean will be multiplying in helicopters. And I don't think that anybody wants that type of scenario. So Africa's development is an imperative and the social contract of the 21st century.
We will be picking up on the climate change topic in our panel discussion after the break. And in the final session today, Mario Pizzini will also be picking up on the issues we've raised. But perhaps you would like to say a brief word about how your topic there ties in with your vision for an African century. Brief, however, if you would. Thanks.
I can be more brief than by saying that I like very much, as Professor Kohn has put the problem. We are now confronted with a common issue that is called development. And all countries are developing countries, because now we are much more aware than in the past that inequality are in Africa, inequality are in OECD countries, inequality are in Latin America. These are common challenges. Growth is a necessary condition, but our target is well-being of population. And in this respect, nobody can claim to be the best. Therefore, it's time to listen to each other and to work with each other.
Many, many thanks to all three of you for this very thought-provoking, very reflective discussion. We are greatly appreciative that you could participate. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, our subject when we return from our lunch break will be climate change and agricultural transformation, and we will launch that session with a keynote from former UN Secretary General and Nobel Prize laureate Kofi Annan. So there's a lot to look forward to, but first we do take a 1-hour break for lunch, which will be just served over here in the courtyard known as the Lichthof, and we'll see you back here afterward. Many thanks for your attention. See you soon.